Hi there, thank you so much for coming. It's so nice to see so many people here tonight. It's a really special evening for us. It's the fourth and final conference in a series of conferences that we've organized in Rotterdam and Paris, in Berlin, and now the final one in New York, which coincide with the 10th anniversary of e-flux journal and actually 20th anniversary of e-flux. So I wrote a little text, just maybe reflecting a little bit on the past 10 years of publishing and 20 years of running this very strange enterprise. It's about 15-20 minutes, and then after me, it will be Boris Groys speaking. So I will just go ahead and start. Welcome to e-flux. Happy anniversary. About 10 years ago, I gave a talk which was later published in e-flux journal under the title Art Without Artists. What triggered it was an invitation to speak at a conference organized by a curatorial studies program in Germany. At the time, I was growing irritated at being constantly mistaken for a curator and wanted to try to clarify things. So I wrote this pretty confrontational text against curating, unfortunately without realizing how awkward it would eventually feel to read it to a room full of curators and curatorial students. Halfway through my presentation, it dawned on me that I was basically attacking cops in the middle of their police academy. I think I started feeling sick at that moment. There wasn't much discussion after the presentation, more like an uncomfortable silence. Nevertheless, the essay version of the talk did eventually circulate quite widely and elicited a lot of responses, although I have not been invited to speak as a curator ever since. In hindsight, my argument in that essay may have been a little bit theatrical and overblown. Curators and curating are probably not quite the monsters I made them out to be. I tend to agree with an observation made by Boris Groys in his recent essay, Curating in the Post-Internet Age, that no matter how subjective, a curator of public exhibitions may still be capable of producing more radical and surprising encounters than the kind of numerical, algorithmic logic of social media, or other seemingly more democratic means of aggregating content and objects and ideas and making them visible. There is something in the text that interests me in relation to this moment and the topic of this conference, which is art after culture, the notion of artistic sovereignty. Here is what I wrote about this in 2009. If there is to be critical art, the role of the artist as a sovereign agent must be maintained. By sovereignty, I mean simply certain conditions of production in which artists are able to determine the direction of their work, its subject matter and form, and the methodologies they use, rather than having them dictated by institutions, critics, curators, academics, collectors, dealers, the public, and so forth. While this may be taken for granted now, historically the possibility of artistic self-determination has been literally fought for and hard-won from the church, the aristocracy, public taste, and so on. In my view, the sovereignty is at the very center of what we actually understand as art these days, an irreducible element considered to be the freedom of art. The notion of artistic sovereignty came up again a few years later. Here is what Brian and I wrote on the subject in 2012 essay called Breaking the Contract. Over the past decade, contemporary art has merged increasingly with the sensibilities of actual concrete political structures, which have discovered in contemporary art and culture a means of exhibiting liberal, enlightened, globally conscious moral values. The artistic field is happy to serve in this diplomatic capacity because expanding its rule allows it to bury its own ontological crisis. To create more institutions, more artists, in more places allows artists and institutions alike to escape the question of what is actually happening. The paradox comes in the fact that the instrumentalization of art as a tool to promote liberal and democratic values coincides in so many ways with the actual history of art, from the modern period back to the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Renaissance. This produces an even more confusing effect for those who see the role of art compromised by its deployment in a broader field of cultural politics, because it also appears that it may not be the art system per se that is expanding, but the very liberal tradition that undergirds it. Thinking about this again, end of quote, thinking about this again nearly a decade later, it may be that the liberal tradition could be contracting, not expanding. The kind of an identitarian fragmentation and political closure in many parts of the world, combined with what Liam Gillick aptly refers to in his recent text as a neoliberal counter-reformation begun by Milton Friedman, enacted by Thatcher and Reagan, and now conclusively pantomimed by Trump and the hysterically fabulous global strongmen of 2019, and their all too real and shocking new forms of nationalisms. All these seem to pose much greater threat to the possibility of artistic or any other kind of freedom than narcissistic curators, dictatorial cultural managers, didactic museums, or patronizing funding institutions. The threat is painfully real. Over the past decade, I have worked extensively in Russia, and it has been incredibly sad for me to witness the relentless closure of possibilities for public expression, attacks on cultural institutions, filmmakers, theater directors. Turkey has been another very important place for e-flux, as well as for me personally, and it has been devastating to see colleagues whom I know well jailed indefinitely for organizing artistic and cultural projects or accused of promoting terrorism. Recently, we had extensive discussions about a possibility of publishing a Chinese language issue of e-flux journal, only to realize how challenging it would be given the tightening conditions of censorship and surveillance in China. In the landscape that is gradually emerging, it's not hard to imagine international exhibitions being replaced with beer festivals, local food and craft fairs, or other types of events claiming to restore an apparently lost sense of identity and belonging, instead of offering encounters with something or someone else, something other or beyond that brings knowledge and addresses curiosity. It is also becoming possible to imagine a profound reduction or even full termination of human movement, from the re-emergence of numerous national borders, increasing visa restrictions, or exclusion of entire religious or nationalities from entering certain countries, to perhaps requiring a permit to leave. I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I do remember living in a regime under which you couldn't leave the country without a permission from the state. E-flux was started at the end of the 1990s, when the trajectory of things seemed very different. As we write in the introduction to this conference, from the 1990s onward, national boundaries would dissolve, centers and peripheries would level out, and the internet would host worldwide cultural exchange. In many ways, this really did happen, but some other things also happened. As people and ideas began to move across borders, money did too. Faced with unimaginable planetary scale, capital became a more efficient regulator of flows than laws or nations. Suddenly, capital rises to become the primary form of representation and expression for the global community. And its flair for flexibility and recombination would even be mistaken for a democratic, autonomous, or anti-authoritarian character, sealing it as the new form of sublime non-governance. Capital's twin, the internet, would also democratize many scarce resources and forms of representation, just as efficiently as it would mask its control by state agencies and some of the largest corporations in human history. Both e-flux and the journal have been possible largely through a coalescence of these technological, economic, and political factors of the past 2 decades, but also through a certain productive conflation or a dissolution of boundaries between artistic, curatorial, and editorial methodologies that seem particular to our period. In turn, these are very much influenced by the logic of the internet content aggregation and an accelerated pace of acquisition and accessibility of information and knowledge. It's entirely possible that my irritation with the expansion of the curatorial sensibility came largely from the fact that we were in some way using the same methodology to develop e-flux, which I wanted to see at the time as an artistic work. Both e-flux and e-flux journal came out of exhibitions. I started e-flux following a small one-night exhibition I co-curated with a couple of friends in a hotel room in Chinatown in 1998. We didn't have any money, and I was merely trying to find some effective way to invite people without costly printing of invitation cards. Email seemed to have worked well, and that became what we still do today. Coinciding with the expansion of the internet, this rapidly created a vast international audience. A few years later, this somehow resulted in an invitation to co-curate a biennial on Cyprus. Our plan was to make this biennial largely discursive, to replace the exhibition with a kind of a free experimental school. This followed a number of artistic projects taking the form of schools that took place in previous years. And I think the main novelty of our gesture was its scale, a large international biennial becoming a platform for a school, and coinciding with the expansion of the European Union. This was a time when seemingly every country wanted to join, and when modern, contemporary, and particularly conceptual art were emerging as a symbol of a kind of a new European cultural identity. Because the school idea was largely indebted and inspired by many artistic projects, we realized that on a certain level, this biennial was becoming a kind of an artwork in itself. But we were apprehensive to say so publicly in 2005. A lot of my ideas at the time were influenced by Utopia Station, a large-scale artistic and curatorial project organized by Rikrit Teravania, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and Mali Nesbitt at the Venice Biennial in 2003, and elsewhere. I participated in it, and it was very inspiring and truly vexing. Was it a curated exhibition or an artwork by Rikrit, involving many other artists and thinkers? I think Mali was hoping that it would become something like an artistic political movement, inspired by the ideas of Immanuel Wallerstein and the World Social Forum. As I learned later, it was also largely self-funded by Rikrit, because the Venice Biennial, in spite of its enormous size, is notoriously short on funds. The biennial on Cyprus, Manifesta 6, never happened. It imploded and was cancelled a few months before the opening, after we ran into serious nationalist paranoia and opposition that conflicted with our idea of an open and inclusive project. The cancellation was followed by a number of lawsuits, so despite some discussion of moving the biennial to other venues or locations, no other institution wanted to touch the project. Nevertheless, in part because by then e-flux had already developed a stable economic base, I was able to realize a version of the school as a self-organized project in Berlin under the name United Nations Plaza. A slightly different version of this project happened a little later in Mexico City and in New York, where I encountered many of the original contributors who helped shape e-flux journal: Boris Groys, Hito Steyerl, Liam Gillick, Martha Rosler, Jalal Tufik, Rax Media Collective, Franco Berardi Bifo, and others, as well as the co-founder of the journal, Brian Kwan Wood, and Mariana Silver, our artistic director. The idea to start a new publication actually came from Liam Gillick during preparations for a New York iteration of United Nations Plaza at the New Museum. Liam suggested that in addition to seminars, talks, and screenings, we should start publishing position papers, and do so by any means possible, not to worry about budget, design, printing, or any singular form of production, but simply make available existing urgent text as rapidly as possible, in whatever way, even if this simply meant a stack of Xerox handouts in the museum lobby. The New Museum was not particularly interested in this, despite the fact that they had quite a history of publishing throughout the 1980s, including an influential anthology called Art After Modernism, edited by Brian Wallace, which became a required reading in most art programs. By 2007, however, the museum seemed to have lost all interest in critical theory and publishing. So once again, and similarly to Manifesta, a necessary idea that was discarded by an established institution could be realized independently through e-flux, particularly since we had an electronic distribution system and some resources to pay writers and editors. Brian Kwan Wood, who had recently moved to New York from Cairo and was a participant in the project at the New Museum, was willing to quit his job at the Tribeca Film Festival and start this new publication at e-flux as editor-in-chief, or basically the journal's sole employee. Our first issue 0 was published online in November 2008. Here is a key sentence from the editorial, which, as I remember, was extremely difficult to finalize and was a result of a very long discussion between Brian, Julieta Aranda, and myself. With this first inaugural issue of e-flux Journal, we begin something of an experiment in developing both a discursive space and a site for actual art production, in which writers, artists, and thinkers are invited to write on topics of their choosing. Rereading the sentence now, it strikes me as a little peculiar. Why emphasize the fact that artists and thinkers choose their own topics? Isn't this something simply taken for granted? Who chooses the topics if not artists and thinkers? This brings me back to the issue of artistic sovereignty. Generally speaking, the word itself is somewhat disliked and viewed with suspicion, maybe due to Georges Bataille's linking it with sexual dominance and violence, or Carl Schmitt's Nazi jurisprudence of the state of exception. What I mean is something else, though. To quote from the essay that I wrote with Brian again in 2012, an artist today aspires to a certain kind of sovereignty, to the freedom to work as one pleases. Unlike artists, say, before the French Revolution, who worked merely to satisfy a commission from the church or the aristocracy, or to serve public taste and critics, artists today understand themselves as being not only capable of deciding what kind of practice they want to have, what subject matter is important to them, what form it may take, and so forth. They also understand themselves as fundamentally free to follow their own personal interest or to respond to urgent events in the world around them. And this fundamental freedom is understood as a basic condition of any work of art, as the pillar that the content and form of any artwork rests upon. While conceptually this may appear to be a fundamental condition, in practical terms it usually creates enormous frustration because it's so impossibly difficult to achieve or maintain any type of independence, autonomy, or autonomy in the world of relations, interdependencies, divisions, and hierarchies. Furthermore, an artist has to continuously work to produce and then defend this condition because it's not something that simply exists in the world. And the perpetual internal and external work, bringing it into being, can become kind of exhausting. I suppose all this must sound a bit romantic and old-fashioned. Artistic freedom, sovereignty, autonomy, independence. I think 10 or 20 years ago, when we started e-flux in the journal, this would have sounded like a naive throwback to the thinking of 1960s or 1970s. But in having observed how conditions in the art world have become even more instrumentalizing and alienating to artists over the past 2 decades, while politics in the world have taken a clearly reactionary turn, it's possible that the discourse of the previous era can somehow offer a new radical promise for the time to come. Look at Bernie Sanders, for example, a politician whose ideas would seem conventional and non-controversial in the late 1960s, now appears as a model of political radicalism in 2019. If you think of art making as a structural activity of human beings, on par with cooking, making clothes, building shelter, art is connected to our basic freedom to act, and it proceeds outward from it. Institutions that arise from this freedom, even an institution as vast and abstract as culture itself, also tend to degrade it. They become a source of normalization, exploitation, narrow professionalization, competition, aggression. This creates a need to return to the beginning, to the basic desire to freely make art, to produce a new counterculture, or even a new underground, perhaps. In a way, e-flux has been a 2-decade-long attempt to create this condition for this type of artistic self-management. And not merely for myself, Julieta, or Brian, but as a shared space to inhabit with others, artists, writers, architects, filmmakers, everybody who works at e-flux, our readers, our audience. I'm not really sure this always works, and we have never been able to resolve many internal and external contradictions. So this attempt has only been partially successful at best. But here we are. Welcome to e-flux. And now I'm very, very happy. Thank you. So now just a very, very short introduction for Boris. First of all, I just want to say how incredibly fortunate and lucky we are to have him speak here tonight. Boris has not been speaking publicly in some time, and this is the first time in many months that he will speak in public. So this is really a great privilege and honor. But also, Boris has been somebody so incredibly shaping in terms of my understanding of art and theory, and also somebody who very much shaped the journal through his work, through his writing, through conversations with him. So without many more words, I will hand it over to Boris. Thank you so much for speaking tonight.
Yes, great to be here, indeed. E-flux was like a second home for me, at least in New York, yeah, for a very long time. And I'm very glad to be here. Okay. So, in our days, almost everybody who wants to operate in the public space speaks about his or her intention to change the world. One hears this claim not only from the scientists and politicians, but also from the artists, writers, and philosophers. But how is such a change possible? To change an object, one has to see, to grasp this object in its entirety. But we tend to believe that we cannot see the world in its totality, that we are parts of the world, always inside the world, and thus cannot take an external position, a meta-position towards the world. Of course, that does not exclude a possibility of change. In fact, the world is changing all the time, and we are changing with it as it parts. We also participate in this project of change by modifying this or that detail in the world, but we remain not able to see the consequences of these particular changes for the world as a whole, predict, or even analyze them. The whole process of change presents itself as lacking the ultimate goal, random and inefficient. And because the process of change is permanent, every act of change becomes cancelled, annulled by the next change. As it seems, this process cannot be controlled, directed, and even correctly described, because we can only feel its effects, but not analyze its causes, not watch and describe the process of change as such. This belief in the impossibility of the meta-position, in the impossibility of grasping the world in its totality, seems to be a logical consequence of the materialist philosophy. The religious tradition and idealistic philosophy understood man as having soul or reason that was supposed to be non-material, purely spiritual, that allowed to see the world in its totality from an external spiritual position. But if man is a material thing among other material things, the meta-position seems to become impossible. Indeed, we are totally immersed inside the contemporary world, or better to say, contemporary civilization. Today, one often speaks about cultural differences of different kinds, but actually we all are living in the same global culture, using the same means of transportation and communication, the same financial operations, the same medicine, the same type of housing, etc. There are differences, but these differences depend on our income and not on our cultural identity. And when we try to formulate our cultural identity, we use the same media and the same means of expression as everybody else trying to define their identities. However, in our culture, there is an institution that does not totally belong to our contemporary world. It is a museum. When I speak about the museum, I do not speak about these or that particular museums, but in general about the conservation of the objects of the past and their display inside the contemporary world. These objects belong to our contemporary world because they can be seen here and now. But at the same time, they do not have their origin in the contemporary world. And they also, and that is even more important, do not have any use inside the contemporary world. There are also other things, for example, urban buildings, that have their origin in the past, but they are used by the inhabitants, and this use integrates them into the contemporary world. However, the objects put inside the museum are not used for any particular practical purposes. They remain there as witnesses of the past, that means of the time that was not a part of our world and remains external to it. That they are meta-objects. They occupy a place outside of our world in a space that Michel Foucault defined as heterotopic space. Here we have to do with the objects that remained after the cultures which produced them disappeared. And it is, if one wants a definition of art, is the definition of the artwork as such. So artwork is by definition what remains after culture disappears. From the beginning, the artwork is designed and handled in a way that enables it to survive the culture in the middle of it. It emerged. Often one speaks about the artwork as commodity, but it is not a usual commodity. In a certain sense, it is an anti-commodity. The normal commodity is made to be consumed, in other words, to be destroyed. Bread is eaten, water is drunk, car is used and ruined by this use. But art is put under the condition of conservation. It is prevented from being destroyed by time and by use. And it is actually the essential characteristic of art. Art survives its original culture and takes a long journey through all the other later cultures, remaining at the same time foreign to them, remaining an alien in their middle. Now there are basically two ways to deal with this alien status of art. One of them is to discuss the way in which the artworks of the past are selected and displayed in our art institutions. Here the focus is shifted from these artworks themselves towards the way in which they are dealt by the more contemporary culture. This form of institutional critique is of course important and useful, but it concentrates on the problems that are characteristic for the contemporary world and ignores the heterogeneous, heterotopic character of art of the past. More interesting is the second option, namely to ask why the art of the past is so heterogeneous. And it is precisely this question that allows us to make a metaposition, to take a metaposition, and to practice a critique of the contemporary world as a whole. We are trained to interpret history as a history of progress. However, art of the past confronts us with a history as history of losses. Why have we lost the ability to create art in the same way as it was created in the past? The answer to this question involves the contemporary society in its entirety, not only its economic, social, and political conditions, but, as it much more important, its hopes, fears, illusions, and desires. In our times, this question is often considered to be somehow pessimistic, even reactionary. Everything in the past is seen as bad, and our society as a fruit of progress that should expand forever into the future. But if it is so, why to contemplate the art of the past at all? It would be more logical to throw it away or simply to burn it. by the same people who want to be progressive, do not want to go so far, and disapprove the radical Islam that is much more consistent and consequential in this respect. Now, the idea that the return to the past forms of culture is always reactionary is, of course, wrong. In his famous article, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Karl Marx stresses the fact that the French Revolution was inspired by the ancient Greek and Roman democracies. In fact, even early the discovery of the ancient Greek and Roman art and writing produces the phenomenon of Renaissance. Time and again, this art was used as a radical alternative to the medieval spirituality and later to bourgeois, anti-aesthetic way of life. One wanted a return to the unity of spirit and body and to the social harmony that seemed to be lost in the Christian and post-Christian, that means modern, world. This revolution means actually a return. Revolution is not an evolution. A revolution is a return. One finds a point after which things went into a wrong direction, and then tries to return to this point and undertake a new beginning. The whole history of modern artistic revolutions is the history of such returns. From 19th century pre-Raphaelite and arts and crafts movement up to the 20th century neo-primitivism. Of course, Marx also writes that the past functions here only as a mask. Behind this mask, one can discern actual contemporary interest. It's obviously true. But why not to proclaim one interest openly, without using any masks? Now, all the real economic and political interests and desires, as far as they emerge inside the society in which we live, can be also satisfied inside this society. It is wrong to think that our bodies or our souls have hopes and desires that could transcend the society in which we live. All of them are born and stimulated and provoked by our specific contemporary conditions of life. To be able to develop the revolutionary desire to change the society in its totality, one has to look at the contemporary culture as already dead and musealized, as a particular social form among other social forms. It is not so much about putting on ourselves the mask of the past culture as to see the face of our contemporary culture as a mask by comparing it to other masks. And to be able to do so, one has to be trained through the contemplation of the culture and social forms of the past. We know that we're mortal, but history teaches us that the culture in which we live is also mortal. This culture will die. So we can anticipate the death of our own culture as we anticipate our death. When we look at our culture from the perspective of its origin, we remain immersed in this culture, we cannot see it as a form, and thus we are not able to make a revolution. That means to change the form of its totality. But due to, let's say, apocalyptic anticipation of the death of our culture, we can change our perspective and look not from the past and present into the future, but from the future towards the present and the past, as Angelus Novus did in a very famous parable by Walter Benjamin, looking with a back to the future, to the past and present. This view and this perspective is possible because we are trained in apocalyptic tradition, because we know that everything existing will disappear. And so we are able to see it as already disappearing. And seeing it's already disappearing means to see it as a form, as a form of the past. So when one looks back on the historical past from the anticipated future, one loses one's own cultural identity. Instead, the culture of the past, including one's own culture, present themselves as a panorama of options from which the subject can choose what suits him. We speak about cultural identity when we speak about our origin, when we look from the origin toward the future. But if we are born differently, we are dead in the same way. So if we look at us and our culture, not from the origin towards the future, but from the perspective of our death back to present and past, then we develop a universalist view of the history and universalist panorama of its possible forms. All cultural formations that this panorama includes are defunctionalized. They do not function as tools because they were left behind by the technological project and technological process. And by being defunctionalizing, these formations began to indicate certain states of mind, more than real states of politics or economy. The history becomes a panorama of imagination, not of facts, but imagination. But when we speak about imagination, we should not make a usual mistake and think that one can imagine whatever one will, and that only reality sets the limits to our imagination, what is realizable or not. The historical survey shows, on the contrary, that different cultures allow us to imagine different things, so that, as Marx also said, the ancient Greek culture imagination could never be repeated. But if not repeated, it can be quoted and reenacted by the act of revolutionary return. And here again, this return does not mean an attempt to restore the real conditions of the ancient Greek culture, but rather its culture imagination, its belief in the possibility of creating harmony between individual and society, between mankind and nature. One looks back at the hopes and aspirations of the culture of the past and confronts them with the realities of one's own culture and with its ability or inability to remain faithful to these aspirations. And time and again, one is confronted with the loss of this ability, with a cultural regress at the other side of the technological progress. And precisely this operation of comparison produced the evolutionary impulse, the desire to return to the time when these aspirations, hopes were still possible, at least as cultural ideals, if not necessarily a social reality. That is why Benjamin sees the revolution as an attempt to stop the progress by restaging the past cultural formations. But what about our own time? This time is actually also a relapse into the past, but unwanted, unplanned, and therefore truly reactionary. Today we are living in a society that very much reminds us of the society at the end of the 19th century. It is a capitalist society on its way to oligarchy, to the total domination by a few corporations and financial institutions. Actually, it is a society that was already very precisely described by Lenin in his book, Imperialism as the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Politically, the society is characterized by vague socialist aspirations and growing fascist movements. Culturally, this time is dominated by the identity politics, as the society of the second half of the 19th century was dominated by the discourse on national psychologies and the alleged impossibility to reduce this national psychologies to the universal human psychology. The way in which the discourse on the national identity deals with the cultural past is reactionary, because it does not confront the past with a contemporary society in a critical, revolutionary way, but uses the past to improve the position of certain groups inside the contemporary society. Here the past becomes genealogy, and as in the old feudal times, it is used to decide about one's position in the society. Beyond that, one finds within contemporary discursive field only one intellectual trend that promises to lead the reader and listener out of the identity politics. It is a discourse on post-humanity, on the cyborg, artificial intelligence, that transcends all the cares related to the ancestry, because here the humans become to be substituted by cyborgs, and for cyborgs, the technologically produced identities are more important than the inherited ones. I do not have here enough time to analyze this techno-optimistic discourse in all details, but I would like to compare it to discourse on the historical avant-garde that at the beginning of the 20th century had also the goal to lead culture out of the impasse of national psychology. The discourse on post-humanity is obviously neo-Nietzschean, and Nietzsche also gave some decisive impulses to emergence of historical avant-garde. Already in the 19th century, Nietzsche proclaimed that the modern humanity became human, all too human, and should be overcome in the name of the Übermensch. Nietzschean discourse was primarily a reaction to the end of history proclaimed by Hegel. Hegel famously believed that after many centuries of wars and revolutions, and especially after the French Revolution, the humanity emancipated itself from all the traditional masters and rulers, religious or secular, but at the same time discovered its absolute and eternal master, and liberation for this master is impossible, ontologically impossible, namely death. That led to the rule of law that was supposed to satisfy all mankind's needs, biological and culture, inside a certain framework of rules and regulations. So the individual became liberated inside the system, but the system itself was a system of universal slavery. It was a system of universal slavery because in the modern world and under the bourgeois conditions, everybody had to serve the progress and the society and was appreciated and measured on the basis of his or her usefulness. Hegel considered the triumph of usefulness as a main characteristic of the bourgeois society and modern society as such. And this triumph is not put in question until now. I would even say that today the criterion of usefulness is more dominant than ever before. Everything should be useful, including art. And the individual is recognized by the society only if it is useful, helps other people, and makes a socially relevant work. In the second half of the 19th century, this dominance of usefulness and the criterion of usefulness provoked many negative reactions. Indeed, the triumph of usefulness undermines the main principle of the Enlightenment formulated by Kant. Man has its goal in himself or herself. Man cannot be used for external purposes. Also for purposes of helping the progress, of also the purpose of improving the society, whatever purpose it could be. One finds polemics against usefulness in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' writings, especially in the writing concerning art. They were very skeptical about so-called tendentious art, so art that wanted to spread socialist ideas. Instead saying that only art that doesn't want to be useful is authentic art. One finds it in Bakunin's writings and generally the anarchist tradition. But this revolt against the dominance of usefulness and universal slavery, understood as consequence of this domination of the concept of progress, found its most radical expression in Nietzschean discourse. The Nietzschean Übermensch is, from time to time, translated as Superman, yeah? So it's associated with American Superman. But actually, American Superman always wins a battle. And he always wins a battle helping somebody. Yeah, if you look at the movies, if you look at the comics, yeah, he always comes into action to help, so he becomes a slave and remains a slave. And he is always a winning slave. Nietzsche rejects precisely this figure of combination between winning and slavery. Nietzschean Übermensch does not differentiate between winning and losing, between life and death. He accepts life as he accepts death. To become an Übermensch means to become defunctionalizing, to become already dead, to abandon the society in which one lives and all the obligations related to it. Now it is easy to show that the artists of the classical avant-garde adopted precisely this Nietzschean strategy of self-defunctionalization. The usefulness of art was traditionally seen in transmission of a certain information or a certain message. The avant-garde artists rejected this role. Roman Jakobson, who in his young years closely cooperated with Malevich, formulated this very clearly. He says, the poetic function of a text or image is an effect of the switching off of its informational function. So only if image and text cease to be informational, they become poetic or they become artistic. In this way, the artist abandons his cultural identity and in general the social context in which he or she operates. The artist ceases to be slave of the international machine of information, and becomes sovereign in his or her artistic decision. The switching off of the informational functions, the functionalization of art, was from time to time understood as a means to demonstrate the thingness of things, the materialist character of the science, of the text and images. One can find this idea in such different authors as Clement Greenberg, Martin Heidegger, Marshall McLuhan, with his famous The Medium as a Message. But if I defunctionalize a tool, I cannot see a medium as such, because a medium is infinite. Yeah. Already Kandinsky, in his commentaries of Malevich, begins to criticize this notion of demonstrating the medium. He says that every painting that wants to demonstrate a medium remains having a frame, and frame is always a form. So the level of the medium as infinite medium is never reached. We always have to do with tools and objects. The only difference is these tools are inscribed in already existing social, political, economic practice, or we have a right to imagine different uses of this tool. And that is precisely what happens with the avant-garde. Avant-garde creates meta-tools. These meta-tools are not informational, but transformational. They do not inform in terms of spreading and transmitting already existing information, but they transform the apparatus of this information spreading from the within, but also from the outside. I can quote here Vasily Kandinsky, who, for example, speaks about his art not as a specific style among many other styles, but as an analysis of the means of influencing the visitor, the spectator. So he is always, or often described as an expressionist artist, but actually he writes in many places that it is the most terrible thing that what can be said about an artist, that he is expressionist. The point is not to express something, the point is to use an artwork to produce some feelings in the observer, in the spectator. The same can be said about Malevich, the same can be said about Duchamp, for example, who actually used and defunctionalized the things of contemporary culture in the same way as our system defunctionalized the art of the past, what I already described. Actually, pop art was started in England with exhibition of independent group. Now it's almost forgotten. I saw the original images, not what mostly is on display in contemporary exhibitions. And it's interesting that all these famous works, you have Alloway, many others, they were installed, surrounded by old bones and skulls. So the idea was that these objects are found as a result of some archaeological research and some archaeological excavation. So as memory of an already dead contemporary civilization. This first exhibition of independent group is very, very telling in demonstrating the origin of the avant-garde and neo-avant-garde impulse of the 60s. So the avant-garde operates not with production, but with reduction of its informational function. One wanted to go to a minimum of forms, but also to the minimal conditions of human existence that would exclude inequality and exploitation that arises from the desire to have more than one actually needs. In this respect, the ethos of the avant-garde was returned to the ethos of the early Christian and Buddhist communities, what was also reflected in many writings of them. And even more so to the Rousseauist idea of the free and ascetic life that was at the core of the French Revolution. Thus, the defunctionalization of the artwork allows the second generation of the avant-garde in the 1920s to develop the project of an alternative culture, the project of abandoning the condition of the universal slavery on which the modern and also contemporary society is built. This should be a society as free association of the sovereign and ascetic individuals, beyond any specific national origin and culture identity. One can say that the avant-garde went much further back than all the other cultural revolutions and revivals before it, to the Rousseauist ethos of the natural man. Not accidentally, the avant-garde started with the neo-primitivism, and its social and political projects had affinity with Marxism, that also proclaimed the return to the primitive society before the emergence of the private property, radical internationalism, proletarians do not have any fatherland, and consumption reduced to the human basic needs. However, the artists of the avant-garde mostly rejected all the forms of bureaucratic coercion, and were in this respect closer to anarchism than to Marxism. They wanted the zero level of the state, as they wanted the zero level of the content in their works. This avant-garde aspiration re-emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. But now, they seem to be completely forgotten. So forgotten not as historical states of mind and culture, but as a contemporary reality. And the condition of universal slavery accepted and celebrated. Indeed, It seems as today, a return to the era of the avant-garde became impossible. We are living in the era of information and communication. That's what we believe. When we switch off the informational function, nothing remains. The erasure of the content equals self-erasure. I think that is the reason why the return of avant-garde seems to be impossible. I'm asked by my students time and again, when I'm teaching here at the NYU, and I'm teaching courses of the avant-garde, is it a return of the avant-garde possible? And every time as I begin to discuss with them this problem, they come to the conclusion that it is impossible because they believe in the information and the information flowing. So the idea that one can reject the informational function of one's own work seems to them totally improbable, totally impossible. And that is actually the deep ground, the deep psychological ground, why there is kind of inner defense in relationship towards the rebirth of the revolution, if one wants, the return to the avant-garde. The contemporary mankind understands itself as a huge network through which the information flows and the individual is seen as merely a node in this network. Additionally, money and commodities are circulating through the same networks as information. So we apparently completely became slaves of the worldwide apparatus of the information transmission. In relationship to this apparatus, our role can be only the role of content providers. Voluntary content providers, if we actively put some information in circulation, or involuntary content providers, when we are watched on and analyzed by special services of all kinds. So our contribution, working contribution, but also our contribution to our civilization in our free time is content providing. And content providing is precisely the other name for contemporary condition of universal slavery. We provide the content, but it is the informational apparatus itself that gives to this information a form. And this informational apparatus is obviously hierarchically organized, managed by big corporations, state bureaucracies, and so on. So we have lost the chance to become sovereign. We can only participate and remain useful. The system of university slavery seems to indeed complete. However, the image of the mankind as a network is misleading. Not we are connected by the informational apparatus, but merely our computers and mobile phones. Here we are confronted with the same mistake that we already could see in the past, in the futurist work, for example, the futurist past. As people believe that the modern technology allowed people to move fast. If you read 1910s or 1920s, text is always about people begin to move fast. But it was trains and planes that moved fast. The people on the contrary sat in trains and planes, immobilized in their seats, instead of walking and riding horses as they did before. So actually, people began to move, began to be immobilized. The introduction of trains, planes, cars, and everything just put people in a position of sitting all the time. They actually do not move. And everybody who used planes here, especially from Europe to America and back, knows what it is, yeah? It's very fast. It seems to be very fast. But you are sitting in bad air, glued on your seat, with strange people left and right, pushed around from all sides, and you are eating very bad food, yeah? And at the end, you are totally ruined. And you are totally ruined not by movement, but by immobility, yeah? Total immobility. That is what a reality of this mythology, yeah? This whole concept of speed, velocity, and so on is total mythology. Yeah? And we are confronted today with the same mythology in relationship to information. So the same can be said about the contemporary information technology. For a human being who sits alone in front of the computer, the informational flows are external. They present themselves as a spectacle. The spectator tends to identify him or herself with the spectacle he believes to be its part. Thus, the informational hardware, the material side of the informational networks, become overlooked. One begins to speak about the infinite flows of immaterial energies instead of finite amounts of electricity that needs to be paid at the end of every month. This whole idea that we have to do with infinity of flows, infinity of information, and so on, is based on the same self-deception as a concept of medium is a message. Yeah? We are never confronted with these flows. We only see what we see on our computers, that is bought and registered, and our other terminals. And actually, the whole idea of internet, if you look at how the internet was sold from the beginning, it was sold precisely as a possibility of finalize the informational flows and make them available for surveillance. Yeah? Look, if we speak freely, that is actually real informational flow. When we are not, and that flow goes through us. Yeah? When we are speaking, as I'm speaking now, so everything is recorded, then it's not a free flow. It's a participation in some kind of institutional process. Yeah? And that can be also detectable, surveyed, and used. That is my content. Yeah? That can be used by the others. An effect of my slave work. Yeah? Okay? So, in fact, what happens now is the same what happened with the first industrial revolution. First industrial revolution believed in the free and fast movement, but the people actually were totally immobilized. And today, we believe in the free flow of information, but the free flow of information doesn't take place at all. It's also interesting that if we look at traditional empirical data on empirical experience that had a lot of ontological consequences up to Martin Heidegger and further, it's looking at the painting. Yeah? If you look at the painting, if you touch the painting, then this movement can be identified, yeah, because there are traces on the painting. If you look at the painting, there's no traces. That is the empirical experience that leads us to the concept of subject and object. So subject looking at the objects from the outside because it leaves no traces on the object when it looks at it. But if you look at some object inside the internet, on your own computer, this is recorded, and the spatial agencies can see what kind of objects you see, so how long, and have you used certain programs to see certain details or not, yeah? So your process of contemplation begins action. The contemplation begins action. The contemplation begins action that leaves traces. So what we are actually confronted with is absolute opposite of what people believe contempt to be. To understand the spectacle of communication, one should see it as what it actually is, namely as a spectacle of discommunication and miscommunication. In our time, all the information is regularly accused to be disinformation. The reaction to any content that one puts on the internet mostly looks totally absurd. If you look at the reaction of the public and commentary, it becomes obvious. When I look at the spectacle, I always remember a passage from the first Surrealist Manifesto, in which André Breton offers fictional examples of conversations between a psychiatrist and his patients. Here they are, I quote. Question, how old are you? Answer, you. Question, what is your name? Answer, 45 houses. And then Breton writes that the usual social communication only conceals a similar misunderstanding. He writes further that books are also confronted with the misunderstandings of the same kinds, and especially by the best and brightest readers, that he says. And Breton ends this passage by saying that in the answers he quotes, the thought is at its strongest because it rejects being judged according to its age and name. In other words, Breton sees the discommunication as a hidden truth of every communication. The task of the artist is to reveal this discommunication, make it explicit, then the artist loses his or her name and age and becomes, as Breton says, the free and strong thought. And Breton has right, of course. When we get this kind of answers to our questions, we think, what has happened? Is the other man crazy? Or is there some deeper sense in his or her answers that we have to decipher? In other words, our attention is shifted from the explicit information towards the hidden thinking behind it. As far as the communication and information flow does go smoothly, we are not interested in what the other person actually thinks. We even do not think about this other person as thinking. That means as concealing something behind the speech. Only if the other person defunctionalizes conversation and information, we begin to accept it as sovereign and thinking. Not accidentally, our whole culture is defined by the crime stories. Narrative literature, cinema, serials, etc. Only if somebody commits a crime or a terrorist act, we begin to be interested in his or her psychology. Otherwise, people are not interested in what the other people are doing. So people say, how it is possible that he became a terrorist? But they never ask how it is possible that he became a dentist. Okay, so it is something that Dostoevsky has already seen very clearly. Mikhail Bakhtin famously analyzed Dostoevsky novels as a places of meeting of different ideological discourses. These discourses use the same language, in this case the Russian language, but Bakhtin shows that the unity of the language is an illusion. We don't share the same language, even if we believe to do so. Everybody uses the word according to his or her ideology that remains hidden behind the public speech. That is why for Bakhtin, the classical philosophical goal of reaching a perfect social consensus is unattainable. The consensus of the diversity of interpretations, of hidden interpretations, remains always an actual reality of discommunication that always can break up in an act of violence. In our times, they speak a lot about artificial intelligence, and they mean the machines calculate. But calculation is not thinking. Thinking is a crime. And more importantly, thinking presupposes the possibility of lying, strategizing, and scheming. Only if we suspect that somebody is lying, we assume that this person thinks and not only speaks. That is why we assume that the animal do not think, because we believe that they cannot lie. However, the process of calculation, as it is realized by the computers, is a totally transparent process that do not conceal anything, maybe only the hidden agenda of programmers. In this aspect, the Kubrick film 2001 was actually a true diagnosis of this culture, because there the computer begins to defend itself and kills all the humans. Why? Because he got something central for the thinking, namely fear of death. Fear of death is actually what makes us thinking. Yeah? We say somebody is reasonable, yeah? Only if this person avoids risks. We avoid the risk of death. Yeah? So to be reasonable, to think, means to have a relationship to death and to fear of death. But in our time, and I do now the end of my talk, we, as I said, are confronted with this project of post-humanity, which is quite Nietzschean again. Yeah, I even read, always without references to Nietzsche, phrases and or sentences, different authors, that say humans should produce something better than them. This idea that the goal of humanity is produce something better than humanity is a purely Nietzschean idea. It's also interesting that the idea of post-humanity was embraced by Francis Fukuyama immediately after he wrote his book that was very much also misinterpreted about the end of history. Almost everybody wrote about this book as celebrating the end of history and a triumph of Western democracies. But actually, Fukuyama was a follower of Kojève and deeply despised this democratic and half-socialist society. So he writes at the end of the book that this victory of the Western democracies suppress human tumors. So the desire to be better than the others, to achieve something, to be celebrated, to be recognized, to be famous, that was traditionally part of the human experience. And so he says he believes that that will return in the form of post-humanity. So a symbiosis between man and machine. But what is interesting about that is that if you try to improve humanity, not in the traditional fascist way, so through selection, yeah, through race selection, but you want to improve it by technical means, by adding some machine and integrating human body with a machine, it seems to be something different, but it's basically the same. It's basically the same fascist idea of self-improvement, of the improvement of the human abilities and skills. And it is a deeply feudal idea. We are totally still fascinated. Anton quoted Bataille. He was also fascinated by our feudal past. Yeah? If you look at the Star Wars, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, yeah, it's always celebration of the feudal relationships. Already there, this feudal system of domination that is based not on money, and social position, but is based on the body, on the nature of your bodies that is better than all other bodies, it's a very feudal idea. It's a feudal idea that now cooperate with artificial intelligence. Now, the problem that I have in all of that are maybe two. First of all, we know that if we practice the ecological process, then everything that is made today will be obsolete tomorrow. So if we produce a cyborg today, it will be obsolete tomorrow. Yeah? And that means that the whole, this process, so the practice of post-humanity turns mankind in a collection of obsolete human machines, yeah, that are actually dysfunctional because they are not up to date. Yeah? If you look at our informational and artificial intelligence machine today, they are discarded every half a year, yeah? And for the new generations. So the same will happen with humanity, and humanity turns itself into a very strange cabinet of curiosities or monstrosities, yeah? So collection of inefficient and obsolete states. It's problem number one. And problem number two is, of course, that the question as a self-thinking is not raised here. Actually, if a computer would really think, it would make a calculation with always the same result. So I'm waiting computers that every calculation gives the same answer. It is 0, for example. Or different results for the same calculation. Or some search machine like Google that answers not your questions, but the questions that you could ask, and so on and so on. Only these machines, only machines that do not do what they are supposed to do, could be interesting artworks and could survive this crazy idea of artificial intelligence and cyber technology. But of course, I don't want to give any recipe in relationship to this situation. I only would like to say that there is a certain gap, and this gap is less and less reflected on, between modern contemporary technological and political projects on the one side, and artistic and philosophical projects on the other side. In one of his treatises, Malevich writes about the difference between physicians and engineers on one side and artists on the other side. He writes that if somebody gets ill, he or she calls the physician to regain their health. And if a machine is broken, one calls an engineer to make it function again. But the artist is not interested in improvement and healing. The artist is interested in the image of illness and dysfunction. It is not because artist is cold-hearted. And it doesn't mean that art is supposed to celebrate a failure or to be a failure. So instead of celebrating the success, for example, of information technology, it begins to celebrate the failure. The contrary is the case. An illness does not allow a person to work. A broken machine cannot function. In other words, both are failures from the standpoint of the universal slavery. But from the standpoint of art, these both conditions manifest in sovereign rejection of this slavery. So, as Breton rightly says, here's a sword, is at its freest and strongest. Thank you.
Okay. So how's the temperature in here? It's hot? Okay, we have the kind of godlike ability to adjust the temperature so it approximates life on Earth as we remember it. Just briefly before I introduce Hito, I'll just quickly run through what we are doing tomorrow, as we have a long day tomorrow, starting around 10:30 a.m. In the morning, we will begin with a prologue, a recorded prologue from Liam Gillick, entitled To the Gardeners of the Creative. And after that, Kay and I will introduce the day and put you to sleep. And Bifo will wake us up with this talk, Pleasure, Desire, and Evolution, where he talks about pleasure and desire not necessarily being the same thing. We will move on to Gardi, Irmgard Emmelheinz, with her talk Shared Meaning Beyond Representation, where she discusses representation as a kind of compulsion of the Western political imaginary, which gives way to a codependent politics of appearance based on a melancholic restitution of meaningful worlds. Mary Walling-Blackburn will speak about our obsession with a good human ancestor, and how we scrape DNA to find that we are all somehow part gnome. Reza Negarestani will speak about what precedes the question, can AI make art? With the question of how world versions and world visions are made. Charles Mudede will give a talk called There Can Be No Advanced African Technologies Without the Angel of Death, speaking about the possibilities of a non-European technological society and possibilities or impossibilities of perceiving that. It's a long day. And then a screening of the Autolith Group's film Nucleus of the Great Union from 2017. After that, a performance by the New Red Order. The New Red Order presents Crimes Against Reality. And the New Red Order emerge out of a contradistinction from the Improved Order of Red Men, a secret society that plays Indian. And they employ here Jim Fletcher and Kate Valk as proxies for the performance. Keller Easterling will speak about superbugs and how to beat dangerous political superbugs, possibly by inhabiting or using a space which could be a cultural blind spot that is right before you, a possible terra incognita where you may have already been. And the day will close with a performance by Ruan Abu Rahme and Basil Abbas entitled At Those Terrifying Frontiers Where the Existence and Disappearance of People Fade into Each Other. And that really is not to be missed. It's a real pleasure to have Hito Steyerl with us to speak about her new experiments in not pyrotechnics, but pyromancy, divination by fire. And by way of introduction, Hito Steyerl joins us from Berlin. Please join me in welcoming Hito Steyerl.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Thanks a lot, Anton, also for having me, but also for the long-standing, wonderful collaboration. So in relation to my lecture, I have some good news, which is it will be very short. The bad news is it will be quite a mess and it has no ending. I'm sorry about that, but maybe you will see why once we get there. And also another bad news, I had to cut this wine-winning exercise because I was kind of overtaken by recent events, but anyway, I'll invite everyone for a drink later to compensate for that. So let me start. The question is, what is art after culture? And the answer is, I have no idea. But this thing I can probably guess from the question itself is that art comes after culture, so it is probably in the future. Which means that, of course, I have to make predictions about this future, and I use some cutting-edge technology to do this, namely artificial intelligence. This is actually a documentary image of the future, because what you are seeing is a video which is predicted one frame into the future by a neural network, meaning exactly 0.04 seconds. So this is what you're seeing, and this is the actual future according to technology. And in relation to the question about art and culture, it doesn't really tell us anything, I think, except that the future seems to be quite blurry, and also the fire goes out of control very quickly. And I will get to the reasons for that afterwards. Let me also mention, I wouldn't mention it usually, but I think this will be a bit more important later. This is a sort of byproduct of an artwork I made as a commission for the Serpentine Galleries this spring in London. So, what does this tell us about art and culture? I said initially nothing, but if we think about it in terms of predicting the future, one could say that maybe culture is something that's more predictable because it's based on habit and tradition, and in the case of art, in a way we don't know. Maybe art is predictable, maybe it's not predictable, or more precisely, in theory, one should not be able to predict it, but in practice, it's usually very predictable. So, which means that the vast majority of art belongs to culture since it's fully predictable. And also, if it was not at least a tiny bit predictable, we wouldn't be able to understand it at all. So, in a way, art is a sort of digestion exercise of digesting the unpredictable into the predictable or into culture. But let me try to approach this sort of fire from a different perspective. When I first showed it to my daughter, and I have, I think, 300-400 networks that work like that, or mostly they don't work, and she's very used to me experimenting with this, and she said, "Oh, wow, Mom, I mean, this is great, because you know the reason why this works pretty well is because AI is like fire." And what she meant is that the content, the video content I used to train this neural network, lends itself pretty well to prediction because it's continuous, it's pretty predictable, there is a sort of probability space the network can sort of deal with. But I immediately thought that she had made a much more wide-ranging point, because obviously fire in mythology has always been a sort of metaphor for technology or for knowledge as such, which was stolen from the gods and so on. Technology is represented by fire, and actually fire really was probably the most important technology invented by humankind, that even created humans as we know them today via the technology of cooking, which apparently enlarged the brain and created the current version of human beings. But apart from cooking, fire may have contributed to the rise of language, division of labor, development of society, helped to survive in colder environments, thus enabling migration, shaping of landscape by burning down vegetation, for example, and making the interior of caves accessible, thus creating something which we today call art, but we have no idea what it actually had, how it actually was seen at that time. So fire relates to technology, but it also enables culture, and it conjures up, you know, ideas of home and belonging and original origin. Heidegger, for example, spoke of fire as the hearth of being. However, if we relate this to artificial intelligence or machine learning today, we can't really make the same conclusion. We can't really draw the same conclusion because we simply have no idea whatsoever if machine learning will become an equally important technology or not. For the moment, we simply have no idea. But I think there is one detail where actually we would be able to draw a comparison between fire as a technology for humankind and the contemporary state of machine learning. And this is the example of what anthropologists call time colonization. What is time colonization? It's the conquest of the night because there is light. So before, the night couldn't really be used for human activity because it was dark, and fire basically opened up the time of the night, time colonization for human activity. And one could say the same thing about machine learning or the prediction of the future through machine learning, because the future is basically colonized by the past, and the past being represented by the training data, past training data. You need to train this kind of device. So if you don't have past data, you cannot predict the future, but of course you need to predict the future exclusively with past data because you don't have the future ones yet. So basically the past is projected into the future. It's a very well-known argument. So the question is really, in this case, who owns the future, or whose future are we talking about? And this is a very clear answer to this question. Mark Zuckerberg thinks that the future belongs to him. It's a very, very clear statement. Future is private and it is mine because obviously of the vast amount of data big corporation owns, which enable them to sort of own and colonize the future. So, but having said that, I don't want to ridicule, you know, future prediction or divination at all, because I think at the core of it is a very important need for humans. I mean, Boris just described it as the state of mortality, right? Being understandably frightened about the future and the risk of dying that it inevitably brings, because I think the only thing that is 100% sure about the future is that everyone will die. And I mean, divination is a way of dealing with this kind of anxiety also, or at least it seems to have had this role in traditional societies, which is the thesis of a book called The Politics of Divination, written by a person called Joshua Ramey. And he has the idea that divination had an important social function in traditional societies because this kind of prediction was not about precluding or preempting the future, but rather to invite contingency into the present, because this kind of divination was not about, you know, precisely telling or precisely calculating risk in order to preempt it, but rather to provide a sort of map of possibilities, a sort of navigational tool to figure out the present. Honestly, I think this is a bit, I'm not sure this has really been the case historically, but let's just accept it as a kind of possibility. Maybe it's also an exoticizing idea of what traditionally happened with divination. But I think the idea that there is possibly a kind of decolonized divination which works differently is very interesting, and there it could present a sort of alternative model of divination. And so divination as such is not necessarily a problem, it's just, the problem is just when people actually believe that the predicted thing is actually going to happen. There is a long tradition of trying to predict the future by way of fire, and this activity was called pyromancy in the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, just like now, scientific inquiry was closely related to fields like alchemy and magic. And pyromancy consists in looking into the fire and trying to read the future from it. This activity has also been made very popular by Game of Thrones, which also was mentioned by Boris, where one can immediately also see the dangers that pyromancy poses. I mean, literally by becoming an exercise of purging unwanted difference by burning people, literally. So there are different aspects to pyromancy, one of which is socially extremely dangerous. But it's interesting that divination has also been discussed recently within the machine learning community. There was a Google researcher called Ali Rahimi who put it very bluntly in one of his presentations by saying that he thinks that machine learning has become alchemy. And what does he mean by that? He was pointing to the well-known black box problem. Sometimes the relation between input and output of a system becomes completely opaque. You don't really know what's going on inside a neural network, which means that you actually have to guess what kind of divination is really happening in there. And he compared this to alchemy, because alchemy also had effects. Sometimes it just was unclear where these effects, what kind of causes were causing these effects. But anyway, because I think that it's much more clearer than people think what actually goes on in this kind of black boxes, I want to show you this tool which I call my political pyromancer. And this is actually the tool I use to make these prediction videos. And as you will see now, I hope that yes, now the campfire will start. And this is how I actually create those predictions, with the help of this tool. And in order to do this, you have to first start the political ignition and then switch it off again, and then it starts hallucinating and predicting the future. And I have called, I mean, this is a real existing tool, and I just renamed the functions and parameters, because what I want to demonstrate to you is, of course, that there are a lot of parameters which can be manipulated and which will greatly change the outcome, even though I have to say that most of these buttons here have no function whatsoever and are pure decoration, and you can just do anything you want and nothing will ever happen. So the endarkenment, or I don't know, accelerationism kind of works sometimes, but glossolalia maybe, if you're lucky. So the loss function, which all this part of the tool is named after Bifor's amazing research into depression and sadness. So, for example, these are very powerful tools. Depression and breakdown, the whole thing just stops. No, nothing happens anymore. No, you crank up burnout, and it just comes to a standstill. But let me switch that off again. But then I think the most powerful ones are those parameters which I have named after political functions. This is the 0.14 factor. It's a real existing algorithmic value used by the Austrian Job Center. What is it for? It calculates the probability it calculates the difference between the chances of a jobless man and a jobless woman to get a new job. And it turns out that the woman has a 0.14% 14% worse chance to get a new job. And they use this function to basically allocate benefits. So all these parameters, or many of them, are actually existing and being used in order to manage societies, calculate risk, allocate benefits, and so on. And this is a specifically German racial bias value, which is called Aria-Nachweis. So if you start cranking this up, then the fire will immediately go out of control, and it will create a sort of Valhalla Weltenbrand situation, which will engulf the world, and so on and so on. So, I mean, this is a bit of a very obvious exercise, because I think that every engineer will know that these predictions do have a lot of parameters, implicit ones, explicit ones, and that they do greatly enhance or disable or in any way change the prediction. And most people think that, because it's a machine, it will by itself create a sort of objective rendition of conditions, which of course is absolutely not the case. It wasn't the case with an analog camera. This is where one of the first iterations of this kind of mythology was created. The camera is an objective mechanism which will faithfully reproduce reality. That wasn't really happening. And the same happens also in machine learning and artificial intelligence prediction. Of course, this is not an objective mechanism. And you can invent many more fancy parameters to sort of manipulate, basically, your prediction. But this, now we're at a point which is usually reached and discussing machine learning very quickly to say, oh, there's too much bias in the training data, and if we just, manage to get rid of bias, then everything will be fine, and all of this can be optimized, and then the results will be great. But I think that actually even unbiased data may be even more terrifying, than defective ones, because they might enable even more successful surveillance and risk preemption. And also, it would not change at all the situation that the future will still be predicted using past data, which means that the future is still colonized by past data. Okay, so I cut a huge part, and I will just try to pick up again by using this extremely useful example that Boris just brought up, the example of the content provider. I think there are two ways of dealing with future prediction, and both have to do with those two meanings of the word content provider that Boris just gave. One is the content provider in the context of the culture/art industry that, provides a content like a campfire that, produces something. But the second is the notion of the content provider as in a passive form. The content is being provided involuntarily, and I would like to go through the campfire and future divination from both of these angles. And from the first angle of content providing, one could say that, of course, one could imagine a sort of counter-divination ritual using this campfire, a sort of alternative pyromancy, if you will, which takes the form of the telling of a story around a campfire. Of course, there is no campfire, there's just animated statistics, so to speak, live performative statistics. And the story would be about the fire itself, how the fire itself has been captured, how it has been automated, how it produces and expresses burnout, how itself it is produced, manipulated, also the parameters utilized for ideology and profit. And then it turns out that this fire is sort of the reverse of the myth I talked about in the beginning, the myth of Prometheus, the person, the human being who stole the fire from the immortals, but now it's the other way around. That's, so to speak, the immortals are stealing the fire from the humans. It's just that the immortals now are some sort of vampire transhumanist platform monopolists who are trying to privatize the future. Okay, so in this sense one could say that this kind of content provision would be a sort of never-ending reading and interpretation which never arrives at any sort of prescription or preemption or conclusion, but continues on diagnosing basically the signs of the present. But this is just the first meaning of content provision. And I think for the second one, which is involuntary, right, which is sort of forced upon the content provider, we have to look at the context, right? And the context of the production of this fire, actually. And the context of the production of this fire is what has been, I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I'm trying to avoid quoting Benjamin. And I managed so far, but now I just realized I'm not going to be able to I hit the Benjamin wall, so to speak. Sorry. So I need to quote him because he's saying that, in order to include this whole context of production, you have to alienate the productive apparatus from the ruling class. And the reason I have to quote it is because I want to change it and say that the productive apparatus of the ruling class today is the predictive apparatus of the ruling class. So how to alienate that? And that's really kind of difficult, and I will not really have an answer to that, but I want to give you two examples which I think are pretty interesting of how the content provider becomes an involuntary content provider in the context of the predictive apparatus of the ruling class. The first one was investigated by two of my colleagues, Adam Harvey and Jules Laplace, who made a research into the training data used for machine learning. And there are corporations who aggregate huge amounts of specific data to provide these training bases. So the funny news is I'm part of one of these big databases in the scope of a database which has been retracted, which is called MS Celeb, which was called MS Celeb, a huge facial recognition database by Microsoft, where they collected 100,000 portraits of people they found on the internet, plus 1 million names of other people. And this database was used to improve, of course, facial recognition in many different ways. So it turns out, of course, that this database, of which I was a part of, has been used also. Is this readable? No? Okay, let me try to make it bigger. Oh, fuck. Hang on. So, in the name of, trying to get rid of racial bias in facial recognition. This database was used to, so to speak, improve, the recognition of non-white people by machine learning, which led to the results being used purportedly to feed into the so-called public security video laboratory in Xinjiang in China, where, as everyone will know, the content providers are usually Uyghurs that are being surveilled by the state through facial recognition. And by doing nothing, by just existing on the internet, I became part of the database that provided the training data and the refinement of technologies to enable this kind of technology. So that's the other part of being a content provider. And actually, I didn't really expect this to happen in the art field. In the art field, data collection is usually much more placid and just revolves mostly around endless surveys of, user contentment and more surveys and butts on seats calculations and stuff like that. But actually, it turns out that this is no longer really the case, because just imagine that it turns out that the art institution you provided the content for, in the guise of a AI-predicted campfire, turns out to be run by a CEO who owns 30% of an Israeli cyber defense company selling a product called Pegasus, which is a Trojan horse. This is also why it's called poetically Pegasus, because it's a flying Trojan horse that is used to infect mobile phones, in many cases of activists in different countries. I have to say, all these things are pretty new, so I brought up here some quotes. These are the countries that Pegasus has been used in, and it has been used a lot against human rights activists. For example, in Mexico, the team that was assembled to investigate the 2014 Iguala mass kidnapping has been targeted by Pegasus. And the most well-known case is, of course, the targeting of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, whose communications were also intercepted using Pegasus, which may or may not have led to his demise. And so on and so on. There's many more activists and people involved with human rights who have been targeted by Pegasus. And I have to say, for me, this represents a whole new level, because I'm used to, art institutions maybe being sponsored by arms dealers, but not being run, actually, by people who are involved in extremely advanced warfare. I think this is quite something new. Also talking from the level of content provider, you just think about all the people who have been targeted as contents to basically tag them as future risks which may have been to have preempted. And seeing that in the heart and in the middle of the art world is something that I think is literally unprecedented. So this news basically broke today, so I hope you will forgive me in not already having a ready solution to this problem. I wish I would be able to have some kind of conclusion, but I think just to summarize, the only thing I can say is I tried to predict the future, with artistic means, using data collection, but it turns out that the same art institutions, which are basically commissioning this kind of content provision, have already turned the tables and have weaponized these forms of data capture already in a quite unprecedented way. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we can maybe take 2 or 3 questions, if you have them.
But you know, I mean, I wasn't just saying I was going to buy you a drink to deflect it. I'm going to do it. Yeah. Yes.
Could you just explain a little bit more? Could you explain? Thank you for your talk, Hito. Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by the content provider and the art institution? Could you explain in a bit slower, in more kind of detail, what you mean by the content provider and the art institution? Or the arts, you know, that connection. In the sense that how this relates to this Pegasus Trojan horse.
So, yeah, while I was thinking I was providing content, actually content was already being extracted, not necessarily by myself, but by the art institution. That's what I meant by that. Yes?
Can you tell us what art institution it is and what's the name of the CEO?
Oh yes, of course. I said so in the beginning. The name of the art institution is the Serpentine Gallery, who also commissioned the work that basically this political pyromancer is derived from. And the name of the CEO is Jana Peel. The Guardian wrote an exposé about it today, which you can look up, which has all the details. I mean, of course, you know, this begs the question then in the next step, what does one do? I assume most people here are in the cultural field. This won't be an isolated incident. I think Boris has also convincingly been talking about, you know, the return to feudal structures. And I think this could be one example also, which really exemplifies it in a way that involves, you know, oligarchy, the state of art funding, technology, and so on and so on.
Sorry, I have a question over here.
Yes.
Thank you. I have a question about your use of mythology and kind of the Greek mythology,
Yes.
Prometheus, in relation to the talk we just heard at the end with Boris Groys, and how you think about return, maybe returning in. Boris Groys was using it to refer to this kind of revolutionary impulse and a return to primitive societies. How do you use, I guess, the Greek mythologies in your own sort of conception of artistic research and also predicting the future?
Yeah, I think it's just a decoy, you know. I mean, actually, this myth, I was really shortening it down, but it seems to be from the Caucasus and exists all over the region. So, you know, just calling it a Greek myth is a complete abbreviation of the actual situation. And I was trying to reverse it, you know, just use it, but turn it upside down, if you will, and tell the complete opposite story in sort of my kind of mythology. What I meant when I was saying that, in my view, probably Joshua Ramey was too optimistic when he was, you know, devising the idea of a traditional divination which may have been more less oppressive, let's say. I'm not entirely sure about that because, I mean, I'm really not an expert in this thing, but I think that also in traditional societies, for example, within the Chinese empire, divination was something that was very well used, you know, by authorities to rule people. So I think his view may be a little too optimistic. But definitely I think that in the way I think about divination, there would be a way, there is a way to think about a decolonized divination in which the future is liberated from being colonized by monopolized past data, definitely.
That's a great kind of segue into the question that I had. I just really wanted to appreciate your connection between content provision and colonization. I mean, if one thinks about anything from Rosa Luxemburg to Frantz Fanon, I mean, it seems fairly clear that colonials were the first content providers. I mean, not only of European, Euro-American wealth, but also the richness of Euro-American subjectivity. So there's a very important, I think, and significant connection made there. And it sounds to me, maybe I'm hearing what I want to hear, but that you might be saying something like, if there's art after culture, it's about decoloniality and decolonization. And maybe you could speak a little bit more about that. I mean, I'm really interested in the possibility of predicting alternative futures and basically running different kinds of programs than the colonial predictive logic of AI and basically capitalism, which have come to some sort of convergence, moment of convergence quite recently in computation. So, and maybe you could situate your own work in that context.
No, I can't, but I can, you know, the thing I cut today because of all this mayhem with institutional mayhem, let's put it like this, was a contingency exercise in which I wanted everyone to decolonize their own time. And we would have calculated the total number of decolonized minutes of the day, which we could have liberated doing these exercises, and then the bottle of wine would have been awarded by sheer luck or I don't know, chance. So this was an idea to put contingency into practice. By not by not predicting, by divining maybe, but not predicting. Yes, I mean the decolonization of time and of the future is an exercise that is very mundane and that can be done on a daily basis. And every time I try to say Bifo, who just left, or I don't know what he's doing, every time I try to tell him by email, I love you, Bifo, I immediately get an automatic reply which states, for personal reasons, I will not be in a condition to answer your message. I think that's a very nice manual how to decolonize your time from unnecessary, you know, activities.
One last question.
I wanted to ask, are artists complicit when they accept commissions from such institutions, whether, you know, it comes out later after accepting these works, and what does it say about, like, how can this be used as a platform? I'm thinking a little bit about the Commission of Forensic Architecture's piece at the Whitney Biennial and how there was a lot of debate about that and how the piece was actually used in conjunction with the decolonized movement. So just your thoughts and opinions about that.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, you know, I mean, Warren Candace, right, is his name, that's about tear gas. But I mean, in this case, we're talking about advanced, you know, cyber targeting. Okay, this seems almost quaint. It's just tear gas. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't want to say that. Yes, of course. I think artists, in a way, you know, being squeezed in this double bind of being content providers, but also content providers from the other side, will, I guess, within this system always be put in the situation to be complicit. and ways of trying to wriggle out from this complicity or confront it have to be invented as we speak. You know, there is no fixed manual for that. And I think there is many different responses which are being rehearsed right now, practiced right now, one of which is also the example of counter statistics. I don't know, having, you know, these Excel sheets for comparing wages or something like that. That's counter statistics. That's an example to use, you know, the apparatus of mathematics for something else. It's also very, very simple. But I think it's probably would be very optimistic to think of a situation where someone who is working as an artist today would completely be able to avoid this kind of deadlock and double bind. And I find it personally more and more impossible to deal with it.
Thank you so much, Hito.
Thank you.